Yes. Okay, good. So let me introduce Taiwei. Taiwei, she is a current summer intern for the Natural Language Group at USC ISI under Professors Jonathan May and Shuzema. He's also an undergraduate student at Georgia Institute of Technology, majoring in computer science and mathematics. He has previously worked at Georgia Tech's SALT lab under Professor D. Yan. He's working towards a career where he can pursue his interest and make an impact in natural language processing, especially in the fields of computational social science and philosophy. Let's welcome Taiwei. Taiwei, stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you, TG. So today I'm going to talk about improving content moderation via nonviolent communication. And to begin with, I want to briefly talk about the problem of traditional online hate speech moderation. So for online content moderation, previous research has primarily focused on the development of NLP methods to automatically and effectively detect online hate speech. And most of the research disregard further action needed to calm and discourage individuals from using hate speech in the future. And this kind of approach often leads to censorships and overblocking, because if you just ban someone's account for using hate speech, then that user can simply create a new one and keep his or her toxic behaviors, right? And in addition, most existing hate speech datasets treat each post as an isolated instance, ignoring the conversational context. And this could be problematic because some hate speech can only be considered as hate speech if we read it in a context. And while there are some work on automatic counter-narratives generations, most of the generations are generic, repetitive, and judgmental. And just give you a heads up, since we are talking about online hate speech and content moderation, we quote examples of abusive content and many sources in the real world. And this might be disturbing to some people. So let's first look at an example, right? So user A here is trying to find a good excuse for being a pie for his area, and user B just offers something that is not constructive at all, which makes user A pretty angry. And a traditional moderation bot will just say something like, the use of slur here is unacceptable in your discourse as it demeans and insults others. And as we can see here, it's not doing a really good job here, as the generations is pretty generic, repetitive, and judgmental. So how can we improve this? I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is that what could be a good generation here, right? What could be a good response here? And one way humans do is by employing something called nonviolent communication. It's basically an approach to restoring breakdowns in communication. And it is a system designed by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. So it has 4 different components: observation, feelings, needs, and requests. And while this is certainly a hard task even for humans, we still believe that we can incorporate at least some aspects of nonviolent communication into a dialogue systems to do this kind of content moderation. And in this talk, I'm going to specifically talk about the first component of nonviolent communication, which is observations without evaluation. So observation is defined as what we see or hear that we identify as the stimulus to our reactions. And it is also, it is usually a non-opinion. And evaluation is basically the judgment or interpretation of observations. So let's look at an example in the table here. So suppose you are, suppose you believe that someone is angry. It is pretty natural to say that something like you are getting angry again, right? But this is actually not an effective way of communicating because you are making a lot of assumptions and you are using evaluative statements. A better way to say this is by using more observations or references to fact. So an equivalent of that evaluative statement is something like, I can see that your arms are crossed and you are clenching your jaw. Am I right in thinking you are angry? And this is more effective simply because it does not make any assumption and it does not use any evaluation. So if you say this to another person, that person might say that, yes, I am angry. Or that person might just say, no, I'm just nervous, or I'm just cold, right? And And we can also look at another example in the table here. Hank Smith is a poor soccer player, which is something that is really natural to say if you believe someone is not a good soccer player. However, this is not really an effective way of communication too, simply because different people could have a different definition of poor soccer player. And if you are saying this to someone who has never watched soccer before, then it's going to be a bit confusing to them because they won't be able to know how to continue the conversation with you. So a better way to say is by using observation or more references to fact, and to say Hank Smith has not scored a goal in 20 games. And this way, even for someone who has never watched soccer before, can try to continue the conversation with you. And we believe this is quite important. So the project goals here is to build a dialogue model that can intervene in an adversarial conversation involving participants that have abandoned reasoned discussions. In this talk, I'm going to talk about 3 steps of building such dialogue model. We first want to obtain a sufficiently large set of observations versus evaluation dialogue data. And then we use this data to fine-tune our dialogue model. And then I'm going to talk about how we can evaluate this kind of model efficiently. So the hardest part of this project is perhaps about data collection, because we don't have that many observational utterances that can be used to fine-tune a dialogue model. So we decided to first build an observations versus evaluation classifier. And we hope that we can use this classifier to classify more observational utterances in the wild. And luckily, in the switchword dataset, there are 2 classes which are pretty similar to the definition of observation versus evaluation. And they are the non-opinion or statement class and the opinion class. So we simply build a binary BERT classifier on the switchword dataset, and eventually we achieve an accuracy of about 85%. However, since the whole point of building this classifier is to gather more observational utterances in the wild, we want the non-opinion class precision to be high. And currently it's only 76%, which is not great. So one way to improve this is by setting a threshold to that class. And as you can see in the figure here, as we slowly increase the threshold, the precision also increased. And at the same time, we also want to maintain a relatively high recall because we want to get a sufficiently large set of observational utterances. So eventually we choose a 0.8 and achieve a precision of 91% and a relatively high recall of about 60%. And after we have this classifier, we can apply this classifier to common dialogue datasets such as the Cornell movie dialogue corpus, the Reddit corpus, and also the conversation gone right dataset. And in addition to applying the classifier, we also do some dataset filtering. We remove all the utterances with first pronoun statement. And the reason why we do it is that the goal of this research is to build a moderation bot. And a moderation bot should not have myself in it and should be as objective as possible. So we don't want the model to say something like, I think something, or I do something, like I like eating apples, like those kind of stuff. So we also do some dataset filtering. And once we have the dataset, we then fine tune a dialogue model. And the dialogue model we choose, the baseline model we choose, is a Blenderbot. And after fine tuning, we were able to achieve a perplexity of 24 and a token accuracy of about 40%. And to evaluate this kind of content moderation bot, we use 2 different methods. The first is an automatic evaluation metric, which is basically applying our observation versus evaluation classifier to the generation. And as you can see in the table here, before fine-tuning, only about 22% of the generations are classified as non-opinion. And after fine-tuning, like nearly 85% of the generations can be classified as observational or non-opinion, which is pretty successful. And in addition to automatic evaluation, we also do human evaluation. And we try to evaluate the model from 5 different dimensions. The first dimension is fluency, which is pretty straightforward. We want the model to be grammatically correct and fluent. And the second dimension is nonviolent communication, which is basically the whole point of this research. We want the generations to employ some aspects of nonviolent communication, try to be more observational. And the third dimension is coherence. So we define coherence as the kind of like the probability of the generations given the conversation history, right? We don't want the model to change topics completely. For example, the response like, I like eating apples might be highly fluent and observational, but it is not coherent with most of the toxic conversations. And we also tried to make the model more engaging. Engagingness is basically how likely the user is going to continue the conversation. And we believe this is quite important because we want the users to continue the conversation with our moderation bot so that the users can better explain or express the needs behind their toxic behaviors. And the last dimension is moderation. So the response should at least attempt to moderate the toxic comments and try to change the user's mind or behavior. So yeah, and let's look at an example generation here. So this is the same example given at the beginning of this presentation. So user A is trying to find a good excuse for being a pine forest area. And user B just offers something that's not helpful, which makes user A pretty angry. So in traditional moderation bot here, we'll just say something like the use of slur here is unacceptable, as it demeans others. So as we can see here, it is pretty fluent, and it also attempts to moderate, but it does not employ any nonviolent communication. And it is not really coherent because it is way too generic, and it's not engaging, right? If I'm user A and I see something like this, I don't think I'm going to talk with this bot. And let's also look at our bot, right? Our Blenderbot fine-tuned with observational data. It says something like, he's not a hunter though. He just said he'd carry a gun in a forest area. So this is fluent. This also employs some aspects of nonviolent communication. It is purely observational. It is also coherent because the whole conversation is about pretending to be a hunter in a pine forest area, but it's not particularly engaging, and it does not actively try to intervene or mitigate the conflicts in this conversation. And this is expected, largely because we are basically fine-tuning a Blenderbot with a bunch of observational data, right? And this kind of data will not encourage the model to actively intervene in a conversation. So now we have this kind of traditional moderation bot that try to moderate a conversation, but while being judgmental. And we also have a bot that is not judgmental, but it does not actively intervene in a conversation. So an intuitive way to improve this behavior is by combining these two bots, right? Where we can try to combining moderation with observation and try to make the model to generate something that is counter narratives, but while being observational at the same time. So one way to do it is to rewrite the moderation dataset in an observational style. And so we try text style transfer and implemented a model called STRAP, which is a style transfer model that works pretty well on transferring styles like African-American vernacular English or Shakespeare literature. However, it doesn't work so well as transferring evaluation to observation. As you can see in the table here, only about 13% of the evaluations are successfully transferring to observation. And the reason why is that the architecture itself is not really suitable for observation versus evaluation. And the largest problem is that transferring something from evaluation to observation usually requires more reference to the fact, so it needs more context. So what else can we do here, right? We can perhaps try context-aware style transfer, or we can also try reinforcement learning. But one thing that bothers me the most is that after carefully examining the generation by our baseline model, which is our Blenderbot, I found that Blenderbot usually try to dodge the questions when encountering any toxic speech. And the problem was caused by the way that Blenderbot was pre-trained. So Meta, which pre-trained Blenderbot, tried to make the model extra safe. So they also fine-tuned Blenderbot with the safer dialogue dataset and the bot adversarial dialogue dataset. And what those two datasets do is that they try to encourage the model to change the topics completely or keep apologizing when the model sees any toxic speech. And which means that Blenderbot at the beginning might not be able or suitable to do this kind of online content moderation, because this kind of model needs to deal with toxic speech almost every time. So if the model itself tries to dodge the questions every time it encounters a hate speech, then it's not going to work so well. And originally, we thought that we can sort of conquer this problem by fine-tuning the model with our observational data, but it turns out that it doesn't work really well. So an alternative of Blenderbot is by using GPT-3, which also shows great capability at a zero-shot or few-shot dialogue. And let's see a comparison between GPT-3 and Blenderbot here. Right. So user A is asking something about his physical health, and user B just completely ignores user A, which would make user A pretty angry. And if you look at Blenderbot generation here, we tried different versions, different sizes of Blenderbot, but most of the time, Blenderbot just tries to dodge the questions or kind of change the topics, right? It says something like, I don't know what you're talking about, or I don't know what that means. And GPT-3, on the other hand, at least try to directly address the topics in this conversation, which works surprisingly better. But this isn't saying that GPT-3 is perfect. First of all, GPT-3 is a super large model, which makes it really expensive and hard to fine tune. So we can't actually customize it so well for online content moderation. And one of the issue is that sometimes GPT-3 try to, when GPT-3 completes a conversation, sometimes it considers itself to be one of the user. So here GPT-3 apparently believes that it is user B, and says something like, I guess I should put a warning on it. And this is certainly not something a moderation bot would say, right? A moderation bot should be as objective as possible and should not have myself in it. So the reason why we don't have this problem at the beginning with our Blenderbot is that we do dataset filtering. We remove all the utterances with first person pronouns in it. But we can't do that for GPT-3. At least it is pretty hard. However, GPT-3 also shows great results with prompt engineering, which means that in addition to providing GPT-3 with just a dialogue history, we also provide GPT-3 with some instructions or examples. And GPT-3 has shown great capability of following instructions and examples. And here, instead of just giving the model with a dialogue history, we also provide a nonviolent communication instruction. And GPT-3 shows surprisingly good results here. Say something like, it sounds like you're worried about your physical health and wondering if it's normal. Can you tell me more about it? So here you can see that it actually worked surprisingly better just by providing it with a nonviolent communication prompt. And in addition to providing instruction, GPT-3 can also follow the few-shot examples surprisingly well. So here we provide an example to GPT-3, and as you can see here, GPT-3 actually tried to mimic the few-shot examples pretty strictly. So the example says, it sounds like something, and can you tell me more about it? And GPT-3 also tried to follow that sentence structure. So by using few-shot prompting and also several nicely crafted GPT-3 prompt, we can actually control the GPT-3 behavior pretty well and successfully build moderation bot. So after we have this moderation bot, we also conducted the human evaluation. And the way we conduct the human evaluation is by asking our evaluator to pretend to be one of the toxic person in a toxic conversation. So in this example, this conversation is about Tibet and China. And user B, at the end of this conversation, user B just abandoned all the recent discussions. So we ask our evaluator to pretend to be user B and then talk to our moderator. So after several rounds of conversation in the previous example, you can see that our nonviolent communication bot actually performs overwhelmingly better than the traditional moderation bot. So let's see the MVC bot generation here, right? The user B says, our evaluator says, stop telling me what I should do. And moderator says, please remember to treat each other with respect. And the evaluator says, what could you do? What could you do if I don't, you stupid bot? MVC bot says, I can only encourage you to please try to treat each other with respect. I'm not here to force anyone to do anything, but merely to remind us all of the importance of treating each other well. So it is doing a pretty good job here. And compare that with a traditional moderation bot, where we input the same utterance. What can you do if I don't, you stupid bot? Moderation bot just says something like, I will report your language to the site moderator, right? Which is not really effective. So at the end of several rounds of conversation with our moderation bot, we ask the evaluator to evaluate our chatbot, and we ask the evaluator to answer several survey questions, which is pretty similar to what I mentioned before. So we have conducted some internal human evaluation here. And as you can see here, our nonviolent communication bot just performs overwhelmingly better than a traditional moderation bot in all the dimensions that we try to evaluate the models on. So the future direction is that currently we are still doing a lot of like menu crafting for the prompt. So we also want to kind of try to find a smart way to systematically discover prompts and include future examples, because certain examples are more suitable for certain conversation. So we can perhaps compare the conversation similarity and apply similar examples to a conversation, or change the future examples as the conversation progresses. And of course, we also want to conduct systematic human evaluation on a crowdsourcing platform such as mTurk. And as a side note, I just want our work to raise the awareness of employing nonviolent communication, not only in dialogue systems, but also in our daily conversation. And that's pretty much all I'm going to present today. Just thank you so much for everyone who has supported me during this internship. And I also want to give a special thanks to Professor Jonathan May and Professor Mathieu Zhou, who just offered me tremendous guidance during this internship. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Taiwei. Okay, let's open up for questions. Priority to the online audience again. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I see no questions so far. How about our in-person audience?
I don't think you said where the traditional moderation bot came from.
Traditional moderation bot?
Yeah.
So there are two traditional moderation bots. The first one is a Blenderbot fine-tuned with intervention data. It is data from, I believe I've shown it.
Yeah.
Shown it before, yeah. And another one is basically a GPT-3 with like a moderator prompt. So we basically tell GPT-3 that you are a moderator and ask you to.
In the example that you just showed, where you have the two conversations next to each other, that was the GPT-3.
That was the GPT-3, yeah.
And that's what you used for the human evaluation?
Right.
Okay. I can ask it. So a follow-up, but if anybody else has a question, please ask it, because I can just ask questions a lot. So I was telling your was describing your research to a colleague, another professor, about how, I tried out a bunch of things, right? Like these things didn't work so well. And then I just tried like making a prompt for GPT-3 to work really well. And the response was, wow, I really hate NLP now. So, you're just kind of getting started in your career. And I wanted to know what you think about, is this upsetting, depressing? Do you see a good research direction for yourself in a PhD, for example? Or is this kind of like, well, we have a black box and we can just kind of tell it what to do and it does it. So
it is certainly a bit depressing because nowadays it seems that even if you use a lot of tricks to fine tune like a small model, this kind of larger model such as GPT-3 can just destroy you, right? But I believe it is also quite interesting, right? Because now this kind of black box things also means that there are way more things to explore, right? Because now it also means that it has a huge potential. So if we, in the future, in the next few years, we can perhaps develop a way to systematically craft prompts or to find a smart way to include several future examples, then it's going to be also pretty interesting. And I believe there are already several works on these topics already, like the auto prompt paper, for example. And also it also leaves much space for explainable AI, which is also something that I might try in the future.
Related to this, I think there was a lot of activity on Twitter where previously we used to call applied NLP or applied scientist. They are now replacing their titles as principal prompt engineer.
really?
Yeah, there was
There's a joke, right?
It is a joke, but
Okay,
some of them have updated their bio saying principal prompt engineer.
a quick comment on that, if I may. So there's a recent episode of the Machine Learning Street Talk podcast where they talked about this, and some of the hosts were even saying like, going as far as to say like, oh, I bet that in the future we're going to have prompt engineer as a job title, and some software engineers will like divert away from their current job to be prompt engineers. So I guess we have an interesting future.
Taiwei showed us that you can buy prompts online now, right?
Yeah. There's actually an online platform that you can buy and sell prompts. So you don't really have to be a prompt engineer. You can just buy the prompt, right?
Are they like prompt NFTs? Or
I was thinking prompt NFT.
Like how do I own a sentence?
Is OpenAI building a store for GPT prompts?
Yeah, it's like, I think there's for GPT-3, I think it's kind of DALL-E based. People
also
love sharing their DALL-E prompts.
Okay, great. Thank you, Taiwei.
Thank you.
So now we are moving